How cool is that? Right? On the beach. He teaches his disciples how to fish because they're not getting it. But that's a story for another day. He's on the beach with them, and he cooks breakfast. How cool is that? Jesus, the risen Lord, cooks breakfast for them. So they come back in their boat, they're on the beach, they have their breakfast. And after breakfast, Jesus has a conversation with Simon Peter, the guy who would, along with Paul, be very, very instrumental in creating the church. Yes. Luckily for us, John recorded this conversation, so we like to believe. So let's listen in on it. Now, Jesus said to Simon Peter, Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these? Simon said to him, yes, Lord, you know that I love you. Jesus said, feed my lambs. A second time, he said to him, Simon, son of John, do you love me? Simon said to him, yes, Lord, you know that I love you. And Jesus said to him, tend my sheep. He said to him the third time, Simon, son of John, do you love me? Peter felt hurt, because he said to him the third time, do you love me? And he said to him, Lord, you know everything. You know that I love you. And Jesus said to him, feed my sheep. Throughout this year, we've been talking a lot about all the teachings of Jesus. In order to understand what it is to live as if we believe what we say we believe, that the kingdom of God is at hand now, here in this place. As if we can create a culture that is embedded in the teachings of Christ, in Jesus' culture, where people can find hope and love. You know what? It's hard. This is not easy. It's not easy because too often the noise of the world, the demands of the world shout out too loudly, and we cannot hear the call of God. But you know, we continue to try. We continue to get back up after we fail, because we know one thing. We are not alone. We know that we can depend on each other for encouragement, for support, for accountability. That together we're able to do this because that is what being a disciple of Christ together means. The question is, why do we do these things? There's one simple answer to that question. Because as the body of Christ, we have been empowered, we have been equipped, we have been called to be Christ's love and hope in this world. There's a problem. Too many people experience loneliness in a crowded room. Too many people arrive in a place where the unthinkable becomes the only choice. Too many people suffer under a burden that we simply cannot understand. Mental health conditions that lead to suicide are so foreign to us that we become paralyzed with fear. Fear that we won't know how to respond. Fear that what we say may push them over the edge or be of no help at all. So what do? We hide from it. We ignore it. We pretend it doesn't happen until it does. This is no way to tend to Jesus' sheep. And in order to tend to Jesus' sheep, know what their needs are. Sure, we can go, we can feed them, we can get them water, we can help them get shelter, but if we don't understand the needs that they have, their chances of survival are slim. This is Suicide Prevention Month. And throughout this month, we're going to be looking at what it is that we, as the body of Christ, are called to do, to intercede in this crisis that is plaguing not only our nation, but the world. You see all the statistics out in the foyer, out all over the campus. There are displays with information, statistics, good knowledge about what this mental illness crisis is about, where you can find help. Look at those things. Find out about it. Right now, we're going to look at a video that Linda Salmon has shared with us. It's a TED Talk video. It's difficult. It was difficult for me to watch. The young man sharing his story was very blunt, very direct, in helping us to understand just in a small glimpse of what it is to live like this. So let's take a look.
I was barely a teenager the first time I tried to kill myself. If I knew then what I know now, well, it probably wouldn't have changed very much. And it probably wouldn't have changed very much because sometimes it doesn't matter what you know, what you feel just takes over. And there's so many ways like this that our perception becomes limited. In fact, our perception is its limits. And these limits, they're created by our biology, by our psychology, by our society. These are the factors which create that bubble which surrounds us, that is our perceptual field, our world as we know it. Now, this bubble, our perceptual field, it has this incredible ability to expand and to contract based on changes in any of those factors which create and inform it. Most of us have experienced the challenges of the contraction of our perception from time to time. Think about that time when you got cut off in traffic. In the city, it was probably today, let's face it. When it happened, maybe you felt your heart rate start to quicken, your face flush. You jammed on your brakes in order to avoid a collision. And when you did, you focused in on that one license plate as it sped by. Maybe the only thing to go through your mind at that time was how creative you could be in the words you were about to hurl out the window at the guy. Now, eventually, your perception would have returned to normal. You would have relaxed, you would have went out for the day, you probably would have even forgotten about it. But imagine you didn't. Imagine you stayed there, stuck there, in that narrow, dark place. Well, that's what it can be like to live with a mental illness. At least that's what it was like for me at the depth of my own mental illness as a teenager. My perception had become constricted and darkened and collapsed. I felt like an asthmatic who had lost his glasses in a hurricane. So when I was sitting in that chair, across from my 8th grade guidance counselor, the only thing that I could think was, you're not good enough. You're not smart enough. You're not enough. And it didn't matter if I was, because these were the constricted limits of my perception. So when I held that 8-inch chef's knife in my hand, and I raised it to my throat, and I pressed it there, and I felt the blood begin to trickle down my hand, the only thing I could think in that moment, nobody would even know you're gone. I heard the guidance counselor ask from across the room, miles away it seemed like. He said, "Mark, Please don't. I heard him, but I wasn't listening. I just took a deep breath. I don't have a choice. Had the guidance counselor not reached for me across the room, tackled me to the floor, wrestled that knife from my hand, maybe I wouldn't be here today. I think about that a lot. Now, not all days were that dramatic. In fact, most days I probably seemed like just any other normal kid, if not a little quiet. And because the truth is, I was. In fact, I was so normal. Most people never would have guessed. They probably would have even been surprised to find out. I would hate the way the sunlight came in my window every morning when I would wake up. And I know that some of you know that feeling too. I was so normal that a few years later, after not getting the help that I so clearly needed, most people would have never known that I was the one that had caused so much commotion late one night when I tried to jump from an overpass. Then again, if they did know, I would have been the last to find out anyway. Because that's how these types of things go. People seem plenty eager to talk about mental illness and about suicide, just as long as it's behind closed doors and in hushed voices. Well, this is the part that I'm doing differently with you today. By sharing with you my experiences, I hope to raise my voice, and I hope to open those doors. And this is how I do it. I remember I was wandering the empty streets of my hometown. I was alone this time, unlike that other time. And it's because I wanted to die alone. My mind was running, screaming, shaking, collapsing in on itself again. When you're in that place and your perception is collapsing like that, those old thoughts keep coming back again. You're not good enough. You're not smart enough. You're not enough. So I walked up and I approached the railing to the overpass. I walked along it. I looked over. I came to a light post on my left-hand side and I stopped. Should I hang in there for just one more day? That's a phrase that people always seem to ask themselves when they're suicidal, I've found. I asked it to myself and others with whom I've worked, young people today. They've asked it too. It's this instinctual word of hope. Should I hang on there for just one more day? For what? To be that crazy kid? I've already held on for this long, and things haven't gotten any better. Why would I keep trying what hasn't been working? I'm not crazy. My perception was collapsing. It was squeezing out that instinctual hope that everybody has inside them. So I climbed the railing in 3 parts, like rungs on a ladder. I was being very careful not to slip. I climbed back down the other side again. I had very few choices in my life. But this was certainly one. And I needed something, anything that I could be certain about. So I turned around. And I felt the railing pressing against my back just below my shoulder blades. I stretched my arms out on its cool metal surface. I remember feeling raindrops under my fingers. I looked down at my shoes. My running shoes were old, worn out, tired. My heels were on the concrete. My toes were on nothing. I looked past my toes to the ground, 50 or so feet below. And on the ground I saw a rusted out chain link fence topped by 3 strings of barbed wire. As I was standing there in that moment, the only thing that I could think from my collapsed perception was, how far out would I need to jump from this bridge so I wouldn't land on that fence? Because I just didn't want it to hurt anymore. In that moment, my entire life was completely in my control. And when you're living in a hurricane like this all the time, that's a really unfamiliar but really satisfying feeling, to feel like you have control over your whole life. So I stayed like that for a while. I just stood there in that feeling, experiencing that feeling of having agency over my life for a change. Eventually, I was brought back into the present by a man's voice over my right shoulder. I talked to him for a while, but even today, I don't remember about what. He was wearing a light brown jacket, but I don't remember his face. I didn't look back long enough, and I never saw him again. Before I knew it, I could see flashing lights from the corner of my eyes. I looked to my right and to my left, and there were 3 police cars on either side blocking off the street. There were crowds of late-night gatherers gawking at me from either side. This was 2, 3 in the morning, I guess. Either they came home from the bars or they just walked up to see what was going on. A male voice from my right side, I heard him scream to me, "Jump, you coward!" Okay. Again, I took a deep breath in. And as I did, my arms, they seemed to rise from the railing, like they'd suddenly become weightless and unburdened. I could feel the edge of the concrete under the arches of my feet begin to shift. I started to pitch forward, and as I did, I felt the wind blow around my body and on my face and through my hair, and it felt free. Then an arm reached around my chest. A hand grabbed the back of my shirt. The man in the light brown jacket later told police that my body was completely limp when he grabbed me, and he dragged me backward over the railing. Can suicide really be a choice if it's the only choice available? We ask ourselves, how can it be the only choice? How can it even be a rational choice? And hopefully we wonder and we ask ourselves how we can help. Well, we can start to help by better appreciating that our mental health is contingent on this state and the flexibility of our perceptions. Whether we have a mental illness or not, how expanded or how contracted our perception becomes impacts the choices that we make. When I was standing on that bridge, my perception was so collapsed that I only had that one choice. Now, when we encounter the suicide of somebody else, we always seem to try to rationalize it. I hear it all the time. And I think that's because we're uncomfortable with feeling helpless and with not understanding. But since we know that our perceptions are created and continually informed by our biology, by our psychology, and by our society, we actually have many entry points for potentially helping and better understanding suicide. One way that we can help is to stop saying that people commit suicide. People commit rape, they commit murder, but nobody has committed suicide in this country since the early 1970s when suicide was decriminalized. And that's because suicide is a public health concern, not a criminal one. And it's a health concern, we know that. 90% of people who die by suicide have a diagnosable and treatable mental illness at the time of their death. And we know that with medication, with psychotherapy, these treatments work. So we need to make these treatments more available in an informed way to everybody. And we can be a part of that change, whether we have a mental illness or not, by taking charge of our own mental health. When we go in for our annual physical, we make a point of doing an annual psychological too. At both the individual and the societal levels, we can challenge our old ideas. Like that old idea of saying that people commit suicide. When I first started out used to beg for somebody to do something about suicide. Well, that's not acceptable anymore. So instead, I started doing something. When a leading cause of death among new mothers in the first year after childbirth is suicide, that's not acceptable either. When our First Nations, Inuit, Métis communities are being ravaged by a suicide rate 5 to 6 times higher than the national average, that's not acceptable. When almost a quarter of 15 to 25-year-olds, who die at all, die by suicide, that is not acceptable. So like I said, when I used to plead for people to do something, and that's not acceptable either, well, you're here, and you're doing something already. Because you're changing the way you think, and that's what changes the world. So for those of you who might be thinking about suicide today, good. Keep thinking about it. And then start talking about it. And then start doing something about it too. And for those of you who might be contemplating suicide, I know that there's a hope somewhere deep inside you. I trust it too. Keep that hope alive. We need you. We need you to be leaders in this conversation, whether we are ready to have it or not. And trust me, if you're anything like me, it's this conversation that's going to keep you alive every single day, as though you've got just one more day. Thank you.
A number of things in this video stood out for me. First was the man in the light brown jacket. That arm that reached around him as he was falling forward off that bridge. Oftentimes when we think about suicide, we think about being that person. Being that person that grabs them as they are falling, grabs the back of their shirt, pulls them back, give them one more chance. But I don't believe that's our call. And I'm not saying that we should not do that. I'm not saying that if we see someone about to fall, that we should not do everything in our power to stop it. But I believe that our call comes before this point. The other thing that stood out for me was the references to a hurricane. How he lived life as if he were in a hurricane. And I've never been in a hurricane or have an experience that this young man has, but I can imagine how horrible, how terrifying that must be. The noise alone would drive you insane, much less being buffeted by the wind. And as I thought about this, I thought about something else. About hope. And about what it must be like to live in a hurricane, holding a candle that is flickering with just a little bit of hope. Hoping, beyond hope, that the winds of that hurricane don't extinguish that candle and take away the last bit that's keeping me here. And I believe that's where our call lies. Because we have hope. We know hope. We can be the ones to gather around this person in the love of Christ with the hope of God's promises to help shield that flame, to help that flame grow until it is strong enough to sustain itself and the hurricane to subside.
Hallelujah.
Through these next few weeks, through the rest of September, we're going to continue to look to how we can be that hope how we can be that love. The love and the hope that we have come to know through Jesus Christ. In just a few minutes, we're going to come forward to this table. This table where Jesus says, you are enough. You are something. You are my beloved. And you are invited to this table. This table where we take this bread and this cup and we are reminded of the depth of God's love for us. And we are reminded of the hope that we know.